Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is Iran. The United States has made it very clear that they will punish those countries that violate their sanctions on Iran. They have made it clear that any country doing business with the Iranian regime will be cut off. If it's yes to conducting business with Iran, it's a strong and stringent no from business or banking in the United States. Many companies have already put the brakes on, are slowing down and pulling out of Iran. Those companies that deal in oil and gas have been the first to announce their intentions. Lukoil, one of the only independent oil companies in Russia, has informed Iran that all plans are on hold. Reliance Industries, headquartered in India and one of the world's largest oil refining companies, has announced that they will stop buying Iranian oil sometime about October or November. French energy company Total, one of the largest in the world, announced that they will drop their natural gas projects unless the United States grants them a sanctions waiver. The sanctions come in two stages. In August, the first stage kicked in. In November, the second stage. The August sanctions deal with cars, gold, and other metals. The November sanctions address oil and international banking. Everyone was forewarned. Creative countries have spent time and resources finding new methods to end around and protect themselves from the ramifications of the new United States sanctions being imposed on Iran. Sri Lanka, for instance, which owes Iran $250 million for oil accrued over the past few months, is planning on paying Iran not with currency, but with tea. Asian countries are finding other ways around the U.S. sanctions. So is India. And even though they are fearful that the United States might eventually institute sanctions against them as well. After all, they are end-arounding the sanctions, not ending their business ties with Iran. They will continue to import oil from Iran. Many countries, especially countries situated near Iran, need Iranian oil. And it appears that their need for Iranian oil trumps, and that's pun intended, the fear of U.S. sanctions. The European Union will be applying a safeguard called the blocking statute, originally drafted in 1996 to protect EU companies from an earlier set of U.S. sanctions on Cuba, Iraq, and Iran. It will be reconfigured to counter the demands being set forth by the United States in 2018. It requires a company to announce their intentions to the EU 30 days prior to engaging in activity with Iran. They must submit paperwork enumerating exactly what their dealings with Iran will be and what their deals with the United States are. After that, the company is protected from U.S. action against them. The blocking statute even allows companies doing business from the European Union a vehicle with which to recover damages caused by U.S. sanctions. The EU will reimburse a company if the U.S. strangles its income. The blocking statute actually nullifies and protects a company from legal decisions made against them by U.S. courts. But not all European companies and corporations will opt for protection offered them by the statute. Instead, many will go all the opposite way and drop all business ties with Iran. That's because almost all large corporations have branches, divisions, accounts, and partners in the United States. If they do business with Iran, those U.S. partners will be affected by the sanctions, and the blocking statute cannot protect them. Ultimately, they know that those tie-ins with the United States far exceed any business they would hope to gain from Iranian markets. They will be forced to make a choice, and the choice will be accepting sanctions imposed by the United States and dropping Iran. If the United States economy remains strong, it will have been the correct choice. If there is no rational reason to believe that the United States economy will suffer because of the sanctions they are imposing on Iran. Sanctions and embargoes have been around for a very long time. They certainly go as far back as 424 BCE, when Athens was fighting Sparta. Megara, an ally of Sparta, was involved in the conflict, and Athens put sanctions on them in order to influence Megara to change their alliance. In the end of the Peloponnesian Wars, they were fought then, and Megara never changed their alliance with Sparta. After 27 years, Athens was terribly weakened and reduced to a second-rate power. Sanctions are a tool that powerful countries make use of. It often takes significant time before they work. Sometimes that time never comes. Summertime in Iran, it's hot. It's traditionally a time ripe for strife. It's a good time for revolution and a good time to stage a coup against the powers that be. On August 19, 1953, the CIA sponsored a coup that took down Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, and supported the Shah of Iran. Ostensibly, that coup centered on the desire of Western countries, led by the United States, to maintain control of Iran's oil reserves. But really, it was about much more. Newly opened CIA files have shed light on exactly how intricately involved the United States was in toppling the standing government and bringing in the Shah. Fast forward 65 years, and once again, the U.S. this time is snapping back sanctions. The United States has disrupted life in Iran. The excuse for reinstituting the sanctions is Iran's nuclear policy and the horrible nuke deal. The White House is convinced that Iran is not living up to their end of the deal. The agreement was really only a sunset deal, which means the conditions would simply expire or set over the horizon over time. And that was unacceptable to the U.S. administration. But there is a greater goal to the sanctions, a nobler goal, a goal that, if effective, will have a lasting, life-changing impact on Iran and on the Iranians. Topple the regime. Iran's nuclear activities are simply a symptom of Iranian leadership style. Their modus operandi, nukes are a tool, a vehicle to utilize power and garner influence. And then, in a secondary role, they are weapons of force and intimidation against Iran's enemies. If nukes are a symptom, the real problem, aka the disease, is present-day Iranian leadership. Life is hard in Iran, especially now in the summer of 2018. The temperatures reach over 110 degrees Fahrenheit daily. There is a drought, and the drought has affected agriculture and food supplies. It has impacted greatly and reduced drinking water. The job situation in Iran was bad before the drought and the sanctions. With these added factors, the potential job market for Iranians coming of age is dismal. The result is despair and depression. Young Iranians have nowhere to turn for relief, literal and figurative, from the burden they are forced to bear because of the decision their leaders have made. When you are running out of options, even and perhaps especially in a totalitarian religious state, the option that seems most rewarding is to revolt. Iran has a culture of protests, but there is an established set of rules regarding critique of leadership at those protests. Violating the rules, which include calling for change, can bring down the powerful force of the police and land you in prison. That rule also includes calling for change and revolt via the closely monitored internet. Given the combination of factors now in play in Iran, the U.S.-inspired sanctions may be the nudge Iranian youth have been craving for, the stimulus that will propel them towards a revolution that will oust their religious leadership. John Bolton, President Trump's national security advisor, said that the goal of sanctions, quote, was not regime change, unquote. But then he explained that changing the behavior of the regime would be a good byproduct of the sanctions. Speaking on Fox News, he said, and I'm quoting here again, "But we definitely want to put pressure on the government. And it's not just to come back to discuss fixing a deal that's basically not fixable. We want to see a much broader retreat by Iran from their support for international terrorism, their belligerent activity in the Middle East, and their ballistic missile nuclear-related program," unquote. And the revolt is beginning to take shape. Iranians have taken to the streets by the thousands in defiance of Iranian law. They are marching and they are protesting against their government. They are shouting, "Death of freedom, death to high prices. Do not be afraid, do not be afraid. We are all together. Honorable Iranians, support, support." Fox News video quoted one Iranian saying, and this is a quote, "How dare the regime send money to Hezbollah and Palestine when the country is in trouble," that is their country. Another person is quoted as saying, "Our revolutions was not to support dirty Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah while we are oppressed here. Enough." Iranians, especially young Iranians, are challenging the religious regime. They are much too young to remember life under the Shah, but they are old enough to realize that life they know is not the life they want. I've also been thinking about anti-Semitism. In January of 2017, a radio show host named Steve West made the following statement. Looking back in history, unfortunately, Hitler was right about what was taking place in Germany and who was behind it. The KCXL radio host had much more to say about Jews. He said that Jews were a cabal. He said that Jews harvest baby body parts. He said that Jews abuse children. He also said that Jews are now controlling the Republican Party. And then, in August of 2018, Steve West won the Republican primary and for a seat in the House of Representatives in Clay County, Missouri. In November, he will face off his Democratic Party opponent. West defeated 3 other contenders, hands down, garnering 49.5% of the votes. His second-place rival received only 24.4% of the vote. Some people see anti-Semitism lurking behind every rock. Some blame anti-Semitism for every insult and slight. Those who subscribe to this perspective divide the world into 2. There are the enemies and friends. You are either a friend of the Jews or an enemy. That, I believe, is taking it a step too far. But I have no doubt that anti-Semitism is alive and well. Witness Steve West and those people in the good state of Missouri who voted for him. When asked about his statement by the Kansas City Star, West explained that his words were taken out of context. Then he went on to say, and this is a quote, "Jewish people can be beautiful people, but there's ideologies associated with that I don't agree with. Jews today are a remnant of the tribe of Judah that rejected Christ," unquote. In essence, West, who has also been criticized for making Islamophobic, homophobic, and racist statements on his YouTube channel, argued that he was not an anti-Semite by proving that he was, beyond the reasonable doubt, extremely anti-Semitic. Steve West had every right in the world to put his name up during the primary, but the fact that he won the primary was more about the voters than it was about his ideology. The overwhelming plurality of Republican voters in Clay County voted for him. He was only 0.5% shy of a majority. Anti-Semitism exists in politics. Some anti-Semites hide their point of view. Others go public and are blatant and proud. The Ku Klux Klan stands a candidate almost every presidential election. But almost no one votes for their candidate. Until 2 generations ago, Jew hatred was not simply a talking point. Anti-Semitism and Jew hatred had power. It could kill, and it did. Survival required Jews to unite against the common enemy. Today, Americans are more likely to shrug it off, to let the Anti-Defamation League fight the battles. American Jews have become complacent. Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionism, argued that the Jews needed to band together. He asserted, I'm quoting, "We are a people, our enemies have made us one," unquote. And for years, anti-Semitism functioned as a backbone of Jewish communal ideology. It was an integral part of the historical narrative. The role it plays in our lives today is much diminished. The proposal for a Jewish state in Uganda was, for Herzl, a quick fix, a place that would save Jews from persecution. He called it a Nachthaven, a night refuge, a place to save Jews from the pogroms they were experiencing. Pogroms are no more, but anti-Semitism still exists, and it's on the rise. And yet, modern-day diaspora Jewry is refusing to recognize the change that is taking place. The further the diaspora Jewry gets from the Holocaust, the more time that elapses, the greater the denial. It's the good and the bad combined. Because Jews have a homeland, because Israel is not under the threat of destruction, diaspora Jewry has let out a collective sigh of relief. The fear of anti-Semitism should not be the only reason to connect to Israel and the Jewish people, but not to realize that Jewish unity will be one of the most important and effective weapons Jews have as protection against those who strike out and try to destroy or damage Jews in Israel is both naive and dangerous. Steve West is out there, and he does not stand alone. Coming up next, Points of View. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. Let's look at 2 columns today, one from the New York Times and one from the New York Post. The first piece appeared on August 11, 2018, in the New York Post. It was written by Rabbi Abraham Cooper. Cooper is the Associate Dean of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles. He is an Orthodox rabbi and an important voice for American Jewry. The column is entitled, "The UN's Hand in Hamas Violence." Rabbi Cooper writes about the role of the United Nations in helping Hamas in their fight against Israel. Cooper begins. The specter of war hangs large over Israel, the Israel-Gaza border, after communities in southern Israel this week suffered the barrage of 200 Hamas missiles, including a powerful Grad missile that landed in Beersheba, far from the border. Iranian money, weapons, and tactics may be fueling Hamas attacks, but there are other unindicted co-conspirators at work, and it is time to call one out, the United Nations. Nikki Haley, the straight-talking, undiplomatic U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, has tried and failed to get the Security Council and the General Assembly to denounce Hamas's serial use of civilians to violently breach the Israel-Gaza dividing line. Attacking Israel is their favorite political sport, Haley lamented. Now Cooper shows that the United Nations protected Hamas from any attempt to call them to task for their actions. Cooper writes, indeed, cynical maneuvers at the United Nations have made Hamas bulletproof to even the slightest diplomatic slap. The terror group knows the world body will never condemn it for murdering Jews or putting Gaza's civilians in harm's way. It knows that the United Nations will always blame the Jewish state. Just days after 62 Palestinians were killed during a Hamas-led attempt to breach Israel's security fence, the United Nations Human Rights Council voted to investigate the deaths, no doubt with an eye toward ultimately blaming Israel. Cooper concludes that the United Nations does not actually supply weapons to Hamas. Instead, the United Nations gives diplomatic cover. He writes, no, the UN might not directly and openly steer weapons and money to Hamas for attacks on Israel, but its diplomatic protection of the group, endless rhetorical bashing of the Jewish state, and pervasive promotion of anti-Israel propaganda encourages Hamas's outrageous behavior. Moreover, any aid or services it provides relieves Hamas of funding those needs, freeing it to divert money to terrorist activities. Secretary General Antonio Guterres is a decent, fair-minded UN chief. But U.S. taxpayers question why they're sending their dollars to an organization engaged in such shameful shenanigans. If Guterres fails to regain control of the asylum, he may soon see the U.S. cash flow shut off for good. Next up is a column from the New York Times. It's written by Mati Friedman, and it is published on Sunday, August 12, 2018. It's entitled, A Palestinian in Jerusalem's City Hall. Mati Friedman is a journalist and an author. He wrote most recently, Pumpkin Flowers, a soldier's story of a forgotten war. He lives in Jerusalem. This piece appeared in the New York Times Sunday edition. Friedman's column is really a profile of an Arab Israeli, a civil engineer, who lives in an Arab neighborhood in Jerusalem. He's running for Jerusalem City Council. He wants to improve conditions in his neighborhoods and will work with anyone to achieve his goal, including working with Likud's right-of-center leaders of Israel and Jerusalem. Many of his Arab neighbors call him a traitor, and he is constantly receiving death threats. Here is how Friedman begins his column. Dateline Jerusalem. Western observers interested in Jerusalem can be forgiven for thinking the most politically significant building in the city is a low limestone edifice featuring American flags and Marines. The embassy opened in May by the Trump administration to international fanfare and criticism. But anyone attentive to the fate of this place in the summer of 2018 would be advised to look past the embassy to an obscure structure a half-mile to the south. This building has no flags at all. Instead, there are Arabic books on the wheeled shelf in the lobby, a few boys with soccer haircuts and girls with hijabs, and a modest sign welcoming you to the community center of Tzor Bacher. It's there, in the Palestinian neighborhood of Tzor Bacher, a 4-minute drive from my Jewish Israeli neighborhood of Talpiot, that you can find Ramadan Tabash, the center's chairman, who's running a renegade campaign for a seat on Jerusalem's City Council. Friedman now describes Tabash and what he is doing. He writes, in a city where more than a third of the 860,000 residents are Palestinian, there should be nothing strange about Mr. Tabash's candidacy, but a victory in the October 30th election would make him the first Palestinian representative at City Hall and the personification of a political shift that isn't making headlines. Now Friedman explains why Tabash is doing what he does and why he is successful. Friedman continues, to explain why he's running, Mr. Tabash pulled out his smartphone to show me photos of a nearby kindergarten overrun with mice and cockroaches. He pointed out the window towards Har Homa, a Jewish neighborhood in East Jerusalem, which has the kind of facilities that Palestinians can only dream of. In all of Arab Jerusalem, he slammed on the table for emphasis, there isn't a single municipal pool. They need teachers, classrooms, and jobs. The way Mr. Dabash sees it, the chances of a peace deal are nil. With Hezbollah, Hamas, and Islamic State and the Syrian war all within a 3-hour drive from here, an Israeli pullout isn't happening anytime soon. To get things done, Mr. Dabash has been willing to play ball not just with Israelis, but with the Israeli right, the only real political force in this conservative city. Last year, he even went so far as to briefly join the Likud party. The political cost of this approach is high. The closer he gets to Israelis, the more suspect he becomes in the eyes of his potential voters. He points to the community center, which is funded by Israel, as proof he can work with the system and get results. Israel says, it's Jewish and democratic, he said. I say, okay, show us your democracy. Friedman concludes with his most important issue, practical results trumps ideology. He writes, when I toured Sor Bacher and adjacent neighborhoods with an Israeli municipal manager, he showed me a site where a 140 classroom school complex is under construction. He was proud to tell me that the city got the project approved with the cooperation of the local Palestinian PTA, which is associated with Hamas. When I raised my eyebrows, he shrugged. If you're willing to do business only with friendly liberals, you won't find many in Jerusalem on either side. No one was signing a peace agreement. Everyone just wanted the kids to have a school. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. Let's discuss 3 cartoons today. All are simply funny. They poke humor at the crazy situation we're in today called politics. Sometimes it's just worth laughing, and these cartoonists provide that opportunity. The first is by Gary Varvel, and it was published on August 9, 2018. The first cartoon lampoons President Trump, but it's also very pro-Trump at the same time. It's about Trump's plan to create a military force in space. Trump is dressed as a Star Trek captain. It reads, Space Force, the Final Frontier. These are the voyages of the Donald Trump Enterprise, spelled with a Z. Its 4-year mission to undo Obama's legacy, to drain the swamp and build the wall and tweet insults at Democrats and the media, and to boldly do what no president has done before. That was a great spoof. Next up is a reserved parking sign for new mothers with their babies. The picture is of a pregnant woman pushing her baby carriage. The caption reads, finally, parking spot for fat guys who barbecue. Silly and extremely funny. Finally, an actual correction in the newspaper. It reads, in yesterday's paper, Chris Cyril's Jazz Albums column, we incorrectly referred to Don Rendell as a terrorist when it clearly should have read tenorist. We apologize for any offense. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, said that there is no chance for war between the United States and Iran. He also said there's no chance for talks. The Iranian leader was responding to Washington rhetoric that has been floating about these ideas, both that the situation is close to war and that President Trump has floated the trial balloon to have face-to-face meetings with Iran. The Iranian leader put the ideas to bed. In a televised speech, the supreme leader said that, quote, along with sanctions, the Americans have recently raised 2 more options, war and talks. War will not happen, and we will not enter talks, unquote. He continued on by saying that Iran has not attacked anyone, and to do so would not be in their line of their history and their tradition. They have not and will not initiate a first strike against the United States, so there is no chance of war, and they have no interest in talking to the United States. China has a plan to become more and more active and involved in the Middle East. The plan is in the works, and China has already become a major player in the region. The Chinese plan is based on the old Silk Market Road. Today's version is called the Belt and Road Initiative. To that end, the Chinese hosted 28 Arab and Muslim foreign ministers. These countries are starting to work in sync to help supply China with her needs, especially her energy needs. In return, China will supply these countries with important goods. The route is not just over land, it is also over sea. The more China is involved in trade, the more it will be involved in policy and diplomacy. That's their ulterior motive. The Wall Street Journal Market Watch published the report that Saudi Arabia is faking their oil output numbers. The reason the Saudis would fake their figures is to report to OPEC that they are controlling more of the market than they actually are. They would want to do that because the United States has increased its output tremendously over the last year. This fake is a classic example of how perception is more important than reality. The reality is that the Saudis need to make themselves look bigger than they actually are. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquant piece of information. I mentioned Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionism. Several important elements concerning Herzl. First, his name does not have an E at the end. Theodor is without an E. If it had an E in German, he would become a she. Herzl also came to his realization that Jews needed a homeland as a solution to anti-Semitism of the day that was prevalent in Europe. He had a dream. His idea was to create a little Switzerland in the Middle East. He wrote about how each Jew who came to the state of Jews would come and speak their own native language. Every language was acceptable. English, German, French, Italian, Russian. Every language except for two. Yiddish was not acceptable because it was the language of the ghetto. And Hebrew was not acceptable. Why, you might ask? His answer was, whom among us knows enough Hebrew to order a train ticket? Herzl thought Hebrew was dead. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.